If you sit down with a group of software developers and have a couple beers, eventually people are going to start to tell war stories, and one of them will be about date time values. People invented daylight savings time to make better use of daylight during the summer, but not everyone observes it. The state of Arizona doesn't observe it, but the Navajo Nation does, which means people in the same geographic region don't agree on what time it is. It's no wonder developers sigh in exasperation when time-related problems arise. There is one thing you can do to make your life easier. Include a time zone when you record a date time value. And the easiest way to do that is to use a date time offset. So stay tuned. I'll talk about why referencing a time zone is important for recording when something happened, and show you how you can implement a UI in React that takes the ambiguity out of recording times. If you're enjoying the content, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps me understand what content you find valuable. I'd also encourage you to check out a new project, AuthorizationHub. It's a plugin for new and existing web applications that lets you manage users, groups, roles, and tenants. Simply pick a route and let our UI handle the rest, allowing you to focus on what matters most. Check out a video to learn more. Back to the topic at hand. Why is it important to consider the time zone when persisting date time values? Dates and times are relative to the person or the process that create them. So let's say a user in New York pays for an order at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. That gets processed on a server in California. From the user's perspective, they think the order was processed at 4 p.m. And from the server's perspective, it was processed at 1 p.m. And imagine that server is in the cloud. It could move to another region, so the local time would change. This question is just not as easy as you might think. Saving local date times becomes a risky proposition. An alternative to this would be to store all the values as UTC dates. But then, imagine how hard it is to get developers to always use UTC. We have bug databases for a reason. So let's look at date time offsets instead. These values include the difference in time between the specified value and UTC. You see, with a date time offset, you no longer have the question of, is this value in UTC or in local time? All right, so let's take a look at an example application that uses date time offsets. It probably looks a bit familiar because it's the weather forecast app that gets generated from Visual Studio. Now I've changed the functionality a bit. Users can select a time zone that they want to use for entering date time values. Now that time zone is used when creating date time offsets that will be sent to the REST service to get the weather forecast. So let's start with a time zone provider class. I need something that will keep track of the time zone that the user has selected and make that selection available to the other components in the application. The provider will contain a React context that exposes the currently selected time zone, a function to update the time zone, and an array of strings that represent all of the possible time zones that a user could select. So where are we going to get that list of time zones? Well, the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority maintains a database of time zones and rules that govern those time zones. And you can actually download their database and look at them yourself. I'll include a link down below. JavaScript doesn't have native support for date time offsets, so we're going to need a little help. The DayJS library is a popular library designed to work with dates and times, and it will generate date time offset strings using the ISO 8601 formats. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but basically, if we tell it what time zone we're using, the date time offsets that DayJS creates will be for that time zone. The next component we're going to need is an auto select box that will let users pick a time zone. Now, there's about 350, so having a type ahead feature will definitely be appreciated. The new component will leverage the time zone provider we just created, and it will simply display the currently selected time zone. If the user clicks on it, the component will be re-rendered to display the autocomplete control. And whenever the user changes their selection, the update current time zone function from the time zone provider will be invoked so other components can see what was changed. Now with that component in place, let's move on to the date time offset control. This is a component that contains the time zone auto select box, a date time picker, and a display of the currently selected date time that is formatted by DayJS. That leaves us with one last component to look at, the app component. Take a look here at what we're storing the selected date. The type is of DayJS. I'm not using the native date type because I want all the time zone and date time offset functionality that DayJS gives me. Whenever that value changes, this use effect will be executed. The populate weather data function will then make a call to the REST endpoint. Now it takes the selected date and changes it into an ISO 8601 formatted DateTimeOffset string. Yes, string. So we need that MVC controller to be able to convert the value into a C# DateTime offset, and using a string seems to be the easiest way to accomplish that. Now when we run this with a stop on the controller method, we can see that the value we selected was indeed passed into the controller. So one of the things I've been experiencing while working on this video is that it gets a little hard to adjust times in my head relative to different time zones. So I think it's a good idea to do that work for users. And here's an example in AuthorizationHub. Suppose you're a user sitting in New York and your job is to add a person to the marketing department effective as of 9 a.m. in Paris. Now all the user has to do is select the time zone for Paris and enter the time relative to Paris, 9 a.m. The application creates the DateTime offset and stores it in the database, and that relationship can then be turned into user claims and used in authorization checks. It's pretty nifty, check it out. So I hope this has convinced you to embrace time zones and DateTime offsets. Drop me a line in the comments, I'd love to hear your thoughts.